Hey everyone, the goal of this video is to provide a brief introduction to just war theory, which aims to articulate the rules of conduct during war. So in order to understand just war theory and what it says, I think it's useful to consider two hardline positions which are on either side of just war theory. So realism about warfare says that wars are justified when they advance the interests of a nation. And so therefore, militaries ought to use whatever means are most effective for achieving the goals of the nation. It follows that realists are less likely to accept moral or ethical rules of conduct or reasons for starting wars. So realists in general are more permissive. Pacifism about warfare says that no wars are ethically fought. And so pacifists aren't likely to even consider what the permissible means or strategies of fighting wars would look like. Just war theory is going to be a conceptual middle ground between these two views. So it's not going to condemn all wars, but it's also not going to permit all wars. It's going to set certain parameters about when wars ought to be fought, and then what means should be utilized when the wars are fought. So just war theory is a philosophical and religious doctrine which articulates firstly when wars should be fought. So under what conditions can a nation justifiably start or enter into a war? How the combatants ought to behave. So what are the justified strategies and behaviors or means of fighting wars? And then what agreements should be arrived at once wars end or conclude. The theory aims to curb the most extreme and harmful aspects of warfare. So here you can think about, for example, the warfare means of World War II, where, for example, civilian populations were targeted in order to demoralize the enemy. This led to millions of deaths. Just war theory aims to curb behaviors like that, and also aims to articulate and constrain the justifiable reasons for starting wars. Crucially, many of the important doctrinal elements, so all of the rules and guidelines of just war theory, find conceptual overlap with the Geneva Conventions. And the Geneva Conventions also aims to codify rules of war. So if you're familiar with the Geneva Conventions, you might find that the guidelines of just war theory greatly resemble some of what is said in the Geneva Conventions. Okay, so there are three major categories of just war theory. Jus ad bellum is about justice in going to war. So it's going to articulate the permissible reasons for fighting wars. So this is about when wars can be fought, under what conditions or reasons can nations start wars. Jus in bello, justice during war. That's going to articulate the permissible means or strategies or behaviors that combatants can exhibit when fighting wars. And then jus post bellum, justice after war, is going to articulate how wars should be concluded. So it's going to think about the conditions under which a sustainable peace can be achieved. All right, so I'm going to look at each of those three categories. So jus ad bellum is about justice in going to war. It's going to have specific conditions that must be satisfied in order for a war to be ethically fought. So it firstly articulates what constitutes a just cause, or a just reason, or a proper reason for fighting wars. Typically, self-defense is the only justified reason for engaging in warfare. So the implication of this is that wars of conflict, or wars of aggression, for instance, can't be ethically justified. It follows from this requirement that self-defense is the only justified reason for going to war, that it is sometimes permissible for nations to enter into or start wars in order to help nations engaged in self-defense. So other nations can come in and support nations who are fighting permissible wars because they're defending themselves. Finally, it requires that decisions to engage in war be made by a legitimate political authority. So, if a war is to start, it needs to be started by a leader or set of leaders who have been put into positions of power by the citizens. This means that political entities within a state who don't have legitimate power can't start permissible wars. This would mean that, for example, militias can't start foreign wars. So it would be impermissible, for example, for a militia in the United States to start a war with Canada because the militia doesn't have legitimate political authority. Jus ad bellum also requires an analysis that the state of conditions after the war will likely be superior to the conditions prior to the war. So it has to be the case that we think that what will result from the war will be better than the conditions which currently exist. The war needs to lead to some improvement of the state of affairs of the world. It shouldn't make it worse. Likewise, it requires an analysis regarding the likelihood of success. So it requires that we think about whether a war will be successful or likely successful. And this requires thinking about the strategy of war, the nature of the enemy, and what it takes to win the war. It follows that wars which are deemed impossible to win, but which would be fought for just reasons, are impermissible. And it requires that warfare be the last resort. So all other means which could bring about the desired result ought to be exhausted. So negotiations need to be tried, for example. Only when all other methods of achieving the desired end have been exhausted can war be justified. All right, jus in bello articulates the permissible behavior and impermissible behavior in fighting wars. So this is going to concern the conduct of warring parties. And it has a number of conditions which limit the kinds of conduct which are ethically permissible. Firstly, and I think most importantly, it says that certain groups are impermissible targets of warfare. So traditionally, this includes civilians, medics, and journalists. This would prohibit, for example, the intentional targeting of civilians in order to demoralize populations. So it follows that the behavior of many nations in World War II violated this doctrine of conduct because they intentionally targeted civilians, for example, by firebombing cities. I think it also follows from this condition that targeting civilian infrastructure is impermissible because civilian infrastructure is built to support the civilian population rather than the warring combatants. It also constrains the use of force to that which is necessary for achieving military purposes or objectives. So it prohibits force that is excessive. So we shouldn't do more damage than is necessary for achieving the just cause that led to the war. Using a nuclear weapon, for example, when it's not necessary, would obviously violate this requirement because it would produce excessive harm or more harm than is necessary for achieving the goal. It also prohibits certain means of warfare. So certain kinds of weapons or strategies or tactics are impermissible. And this includes chemical weapons, torture, and maiming. These are thought to be unethical in themselves, regardless of the strategic objectives they might obtain or achieve. And then finally, jus post bellum articulates the kinds of agreements or settlements that ought to be arrived at once a war is concluded. And here the idea is that by ending the war in a certain way, we can produce a more sustainable or lasting peace. So it requires that war crimes committed during warfare be punished in order to achieve justice for victims. It requires that victims of war crimes be compensated to the greatest extent possible. So these are two related conditions. When wars end, it needs to be recognized when ethical prohibitions are violated. So when, for example, civilians are targeted, or when certain impermissible means of warfare are used, especially against civilian populations, and those civilian populations ought to be compensated. So there is a requirement of recognizing in order to achieve justice, and then compensating in order to make victims more whole to the greatest extent that that's possible. And sometimes that won't be possible given the nature of warfare. And then finally, in order to try to achieve peace that's lasting, it requires that peace treaties take account of the needs of all warring parties, so maybe even the aggressor. And to the greatest extent possible, it strives to achieve a return to the status quo. So that's a requirement which aims to think about how we can end wars in ways that will reduce the likelihood of another conflagration, of another war breaking out. Brief review. So just war theory is a reaction to the excesses of war, like those excesses we saw in World War II, but also maybe the excesses that we're seeing in the current conflict between Ukraine and Russia, or between the IDF and Hamas, or maybe even the IDF and Hezbollah. It finds a middle ground between views which prohibit all wars and those which permit any war and any means of combat. So it's a middle ground between realist positions which say nations should defend their interest and use whatever means possible, and pacifism which says no warfare is justified. It's a middle ground because it says some wars are justified and some means of fighting wars are justified. It provides three sets of conditions. First, the conditions for permissibly fighting or starting wars, the conditions for permissible means or strategies. So this is a list of permitted strategies and impermissible strategies, like torture, maiming, chemical weapons, the targeting of civilians. And then finally, it articulates the kinds of actions and agreements that ought to be undertaken once wars end with the aim of producing a sustainable peace.